differently by saying outlined text field defaults, it's actually called. Not sure why it doesn't have the dependency. Colors, text field colors, text field defaults dot outline, that it is. Outline text field colors. And in here, we will have a text color. Actually, the text colors can stay at the default. Since we have a white background, it will just be the on background color, I think, from our theme. But let's change the cursor color to our dark blue from our colors file, as well as the focused border color to something like sand yellow. So you can see the sand yellow color here is the border color, and the cursor color is this dark blue one. Something we might also want to pass is a placeholder. So when there is nothing here, then we will include the search text, placeholder, make this a text. And here we actually want to use string resources. So we say the text is a string resource, where we say res from here, this resources. So this is how these shared resources work for Compose multi-platform. res.string.search hint. And I'm not sure if we can create these with Alt-Enter. No, we can actually do this for Android resources, but not for Compose multi-platform, as of now at least. So let's create these manually by going to common main, Compose resources. That is where these are located, like for example, a Compose multi-platform vector. And if we would want to create string resources, we would create a values directory. And in there, we will create a new file called strings.xml. Make sure to have the same namings so Compose can actually find these resources. Here, first of all, we want to add this XML metadata. Encoding can be UTF-8. And then we will have a resources tag. Don't worry if the auto-completion doesn't work here. It's just a bit atypical for Android Studio that we put our resources in a random folder, since Android Studio is not that closely coupled with a Compose multi-platform yet. Nevertheless, we can make this work by having string resources in here, where each XML string needs a name. So just the string resource ID. So for example, what is this? Search. And the text will then be search. Let's call it search hint, actually, is a bit more expressive. So here in book search bar, we can now say res string search hint, which is not available because those resources are actually generated after a rebuild. So what we can do is we can click on make module, and this should hopefully generate the corresponding Kotlin and Compose multi-platform classes that implement this string resource-like behavior and also would allow us to localize this app. You can see my rebuild actually failed because we need to import this. So it's what Compose did is it generated a separate class, which is not included by default. But once we import this, then it will be recognized, and a rebuild should now also succeed once we did. This is actually much faster once we rebuild our project once, so these incremental rebuilds will not take that much time anymore. But in my experience, the first rebuild of a Compose multi-platform project can take ages, at this point at least. All right, next up we have a leading icon, which will be the leading icon. Let's take a look. So in this case, it will be this search icon, which we want to display here. So just icon, where we say, okay, we got an image vector, icons.default.search. There's already a ready-made icon for that. The content description can be null here. And the tint of this can be our material theme, this one, .colors. Is it actually, that looks a lot like material 2, but why don't we use material 3 here actually? I'm not sure, didn't I include this dependency? Let's quickly take a look. Because with material 3, it would actually be called material theme dot color scheme instead of colors, which is a bit odd. Let's take a look at our version catalog. We do have our, where's Compose? Is there any reference to material 3? No, didn't I include that? I think for Compose multi-platform, it's already coming from the Compose multi-platform framework. So we need to change this here in build.gradle of our main module. And here you can see there are certain dependencies that come from Compose. I didn't add those myself. Those already come from Compose multi-platform from the Gradle plugin. If we switch to material 3 here, this should hopefully fix it. We might also need to re-import these UI components, but just making sure that everybody of you gets the same outcomes here with these components. Let's make sure that we all use the same material version. This way, after syncing, we should probably get some errors here in book app search bar. Yes, because we need this new import, you can see, from material 3. Alt enter to do that. And now it's actually here, this one we also need to import. And now it's actually also called differently, which I thought at first. Here it's now outline text field defaults dot colors. And then it will do the same. Also need to do the same for texts. Not the one from Kato here, but the composable. Need to import this icon from material 3 this time. And now we should also be able to set the tint to our material theme color scheme. There it is, that on surface. And we give it an alpha of 0.66f. So then we get this grayish effect here. In between, we can also just optimize our imports or remove these here manually. And then take a look in our previews. Where is that? Previews here. Maybe we see something here. Need to re-import the material theme here as well. It seems we would need this dependency for the Android side as well. Then let's ignore this and just show this search bar for our preview as it is. Reload this. And then we also need to actually fix this here. This is actually just the standard app composable here. We can get rid of all that. This is really just the standard initial code that we don't need in our app. We can optimize all those imports. Take a look if this is now fixed. Yes. Now we can actually see an actual search bar here. And for the background color, we could also put this in a box. Modifier fill max width. Give this a background of color.white from compose now. And then put this in here. And yes, now we also have a much more decent preview here. If we don't have a search query, then you will notice, or if we actually make this empty, then we should see our placeholder. Yes, there it is, search. So we can go back to our book search bar and continue working on it. What else is important for this text field? Well, we certainly need this to be single line. So we set single line to true, so we can't have any actual new lines there. We want to trigger our IME search action by saying keyboard actions is keyboard actions on search. This will simply be our IME search. Seems like we need to create this lambda here and then trigger on IME search. So this will be triggered when we click on this green search button here. And when we then type something here, you will notice that this close icon actually fades in and fades out. We can achieve this with a trailing icon this time. In order to make it fade in and out automatically, we can work with an animated visibility, where we say, okay, the visibility actually changes based on our search query not being empty. So if it's not blank actually, then we want to show the icon, otherwise we don't. And whenever this changes, we will animate the transition. In here we can then have our icon button. When we click this, we will simply call our on search query change and pass in an empty query. So we just say, hey, the search updated with an empty text. When we say we have an icon with an image vector of icons, icons.default. What is this? Close, yes. Content description would be a string resource, r.string, and we pass in our close hint. Actually not r, it's res here in compose multi-platform. Close hint, and I think we still can't create this here from the context menu. No, let's then go to our strings XML. Here we now just need to copy paste this and make this a close hint and say clear search or so. This is really purely for accessibility reasons that we give our icon button here a clear content description so that screen readers could also kind of read what the button is for. So even blind people also could use this app in some sense. We can then give this a tint of material theme, color scheme on surface. This time we give this a full on surface color without any alpha value, because this is really meant to be interactable and should be a prominent action. We can then make our module again, and we should hopefully be able to see a valid import for this close hint string resource. Yep, there we go. We probably need to import it again. So this is still a bit annoying about Compose multi-platform, or at least better for native Android. that we don't have to generate resources with rebuilding, but it is what it is, and that is definitely a trade-off we can accept, I think. All right, I think we also need to define that we actually have a search IME action, so that this search button appears in the first place in our keyboard, simply by saying keyboard options is keyboard options, where we say the keyboard type is keyboard type.text. So we just want to be able to enter normal text here. And the IME action would be IME action.search. So this icon actually pops up. When we click it, this will trigger. And the only real thing that is left is making use of this modifier here. Let's do this at the very bottom. Passing in our modifier, we might want to give this text field a background color, where we say the shape of the background is again our rounded corner shape with 100%. So the background is also adjusted to this rounded corners, and the color will be desert white, which we've added previously. And we want to add a minimum interactive component size. So what this will do is, if we take a look at the docs here, it will reserve at least 40 dp in size to make sure that these touch interactions, for example, for this close icon, that there is at least that much space for those for this trailing icon button. So even if the composable would measure smaller, we make sure that we at least have this space for this trailing icon button. And if we now take a look in our previews again, then we should be able to see a fully fledged search bar. After reloading, yes, there we go. Here it is. We could also start the interactive mode, this one here. If we type something in there, you can see our yellow border, our orange border, and we can then enter something. No, we can't because we did not provide an implementation for this lambda here, obviously. A little fun thing we could do is that we also change the cursor color. So you will notice this, not the cursor color, but the text selection color. So when we type something here, oops, right here, test, and we highlight this text, you can see it also marks this in this orange that fits to our theme of our app. We can achieve this by hopping into our search bar composable and saying composition local provider, and we say a local text selection colors dot provides, or just saying provides text selection colors. The handle color will be sand yellow, as well as the background color. Sand yellow. Open a block of code and then put our outline text field in there. So what we can do with this is that we can change the actual value that a local text selection colors.current will provide for all the code that comes in here. So those are just typical values you might want to retrieve easily in composables, application-wide, and all the composables that now come in here will use those provided text selection colors. And we could also easily test this already by going to our book list screen and just adding this new composable here. So we could say we have a column. We say modifier is modifier fill max size. We give this screen a background color of white, or let's actually say dark blue. Not color.dark blue, but dark blue from our colors KT file, because this is the background color of our actual background, and then our column, our list will be drawn on top of that. We give this some status bars padding, so we consider the padding here for our status bar. And we can say horizontal alignment is alignment center horizontally. And in here, let's just have our book search bar, where the search query is now our state.search query, where our on search query change will now trigger our on action lambda, where we say, when this search query changes, we want to trigger our book list action. That on search query change with it, so the new search query. So this will be sent to the view model. The view model will then receive this here. It will update the state. When the state changes, since it's a state flow, it will trigger an update in the UI again. So the UI will show the new updated search query in the text field. Then when we actually click on IME search, we're actually not going to perform a real search here because the search triggers after 500 milliseconds automatically. So I think, yeah, that doesn't matter, that we actually need to provide a way to let users search even faster. But what we will use this for is we want to hide the keyboard. So when we click this, the keyboard will be hidden, as you can see. We can do this with the keyboard controller, local software keyboard controller .current. We can then use this in here to say keyboard controller !hide. So we just hide our keyboard. And lastly, let's pass in a modifier. Modifier dot within passing in a minimum width of 400 dp, actually a maximum width. So the search bar doesn't become too large, especially on desktop devices. That's always something you need to think of course, if you're building a KMP app that also targets larger screens. So we say the width of this text field will never be larger than 400 dp. We still try to fill the maximum width of our screen, unless that would be more than 400 dp. And then we add some padding, 16 dp for example. And we could already try this out by taking this book list screen composable, going to our entry point, our application composable. Let's also get rid of this greeting and platform, by the way, which we also need to get rid of here for each platform. So platform.android can be deleted, platform JVM can be deleted, and platform.iOS can also be deleted. This is the entry point. So this is the composable that will show up at first. So here we can say we got a book list screen root. The view model can for now be just a view model constructed with remember, since we don't need to pass in any dependencies yet. So really just for this demonstrational purposes. And when we click on a book, we would perform the navigation, but we also don't yet have a nav controller. And this application composable will now be drawn in our normal Android main activity. So if you're an Android developer, this will be familiar to you. You can see there it is. This comes from the shared code. If we are on desktop, we really just have a pure main function, which is created with this application function here, which gives us a composable scope, creates a window, and then also calls this app. For iOS, we have this main view controller, which in the end just constructs this view controller, which is an iOS concept of a view of a UI component, and then also lets us call composables in there. So this way, let's actually run this on Android. Clicking run, taking a look here, and hopefully see some sort of decent looking search bar. There we go, and we do see that. Here's our search bar. We can hopefully change this, yes, because we've already added the logic to update the state. And when we actually click on clear, we can also already clear our text. That is very cool. So what is the next step? Let's actually switch back to our reference app. Next up, I would say what would make sense to implement is a composable for all these different list items. All right, let's take a look at our package structure again to check where we want to put this book list item composable. Definitely not in our Android main source set, because that would be for Android specific UI components or classes in general. We want to put this in common main book list components again, of course, since this is an exclusive reusable component for the book list screen. So here, book list item, for example, make this a file, composable, and we call this book list item. Well, and what does a book list item need in order to display some data? Obviously a book. And we might also want to pass an on-click lambda when we click this, so we can then navigate to the detail screen later on. Let's make this a bit larger again, so we actually see what we plan to build. So we now plan to build such a book list item here, where we can first of all start with this surface around. So this little light bluish kind of background. For that, we can use a material surface composable that is just used to create such a surface. Let's give it a rounded corner shape. So shape is rounded corner shape of 25 dp. Well, let's say 32 dp, that's at least, I think what I used here, 32 dp as a rounding. Then we give it a modifier, so we pass in the modifier we have passed in here, and we make that clickable. And when we click this, we can say onClick is equal to the onClick function, the onClick lambda that we pass to this composable. And the color of this surface will be light blue, the one that we actually defined in our colors KT file, and we say copy and set the alpha to 0.2f. So let's now think about what kind of components and layouts we do need for to just display what we want to display for such an item. So we definitely need a row, because this image here, the book cover, needs to be displayed in a row-like fashion together with a column here, a column of 3 texts. Then we have another row in here for this text and this star icon. And then in this very outer row, in the root row, we then have this final arrow icon. So first of all, let's define this very outer row for the book cover, for these 3 texts, and for the final icon. The modifier for this one will be modifier.padding. First of all, let's add 16 dp of padding. We say fill max width, and we then say height, and we set this to intrinsic size dot minimum. What is intrinsic size? That is in the end a way to give this row a fixed height that is still dynamic in some sense. So if we want to keep our layouts here somewhat dynamic, that the proportions of how much width this image takes, of how much width this text section takes, and so on, if these are dynamic, also based on the screen size of the device, then we need a way to find out which part of this row actually has the highest height. Because if we wouldn't use intrinsic size.min here, then it could be that this text spans more height on certain device types than the image, or the image spans more height on certain device types than this text. And we don't know that yet during development, which of these powers will span over more height. So with intrinsic size.min, we give the height of this whole row here, of our whole list item, the minimum height that we need to fit all of the single children in. So the minimum height that is needed to perfectly fit in the image, to perfectly fit in the text section and the icon here. Because if we then use fill max height somewhere inside of this row, normally without giving this a fixed height, it would just span the whole screen's height, because it would that's how fill max height works. But if we give this row a fixed height by using this height modifier, then it will always have the same height, or at least this minimum intrinsic size. I hope that makes sense. Then for this image, for this book cover, I actually want to put this in a box, because when we load new images, then we have this loading animation here, as you can see, which is a separate composable. We will implement all those animations at the end of the course. So we'll focus on functionality, but we can already think of this aspect when designing this list item, that we just have a box in which we can conveniently swap out the contents of that, so the composable. So either the book cover or the animation. The modifier of this box will be modifier dot, let's give this a height of 100 dp, for example, and we want to make sure that everything is centered in this box. Well, and now what comes inside of this box, if we put the animation aside for now, is this book cover, of course. But as you can see, certain book covers are available, and for some, there is just no book cover available on the API. In that case, we want to display this kind of a generic failure icon or so. So let's think through how we can do this. In the end, our image loading library that we use here is called Coil. That is a Kotlin image loading library that I can only recommend for Compose and Kotlin multi-platform projects, but also for Android, that library is great. And if we want to now observe the current state of the of loading a specific image from a web URL, if we want to do that with Coil, then we need to keep track of that with a Compose state. So we say we keep a reference to our image load result. We say that is equal to by remember, and in here we will then have a mutable state of, and the state will consist of a result. And here's important that you import this Kotlin result. For this use case, we're fine with that. We don't want to use our custom result class. This will be a Kotlin result of type painter, and this whole result can be nullable. Actually in here, and then we need to close this off like this and make this null initially. Like this. We then Alt-Enter to import this by remember delegate. Then we have our very initial state. So the result can either be a successful result or a failure of type painter. So if it was successful, then we get a painter, which we can use to paint or draw an image. And initially we don't yet have any result. In order to then get the painter, we can say val painter is equal to remember async image painter. That now comes from Coil. The model that we have to pass is in the end the image we want to load. So you can see Coil takes in anything here. So this could be a bitmap, this could be an image URL, and then Coil will figure out how to load this image. In our case, this is simply the image URL of our book. Then we can override this onSuccess lambda, which will trigger when the image was successfully loaded. This will then give us access to this async image painter state.success. But here a little catch is that sometimes the API seems to actually provide an image with no real valid dimensions, so with a size of 0. So we want to make that check if that actually is the case. So if it dot painter dot intrinsic size, so the size of the image, if the width is larger than 1, and the same is actually the case for the height. So height is also larger than 1. If that's the case, if we have a valid image, then we want to say result.success, and we pass in it. Actually the painter here behind this it. Otherwise, if we successfully loaded an image, but it's 1 by 1 pixels, then we want to say, okay, that's actually not a successful result. And we say result.failure, and we can pass in a custom exception here where we say invalid image size or so. What kind of issue does it complain here? Okay, it's not thrown. We don't need to throw this exception here. We really just need to pass it to the failure, so we get an error message. And this whole thing we then need to assign to our image load result. If there was an error with loading the image, then on error will trigger So this would be the case, for example, if we don't have internet connection. Then we could say, okay, we first of all want to actually print the stack trace of what went wrong. So we get to see the logs if an image failed to load. And then we say image load result is result.failure. And we pass in this throwable. So it result throwable. All right. Next up, now that we have our painter that we can use to actually draw an image. Right now, we don't really draw anything because this is really just a state and not a real composable, at least not a visual composable. So what we want to do is when val result is equal to our image load result, when that is null, actually null, then that means we are still loading this image. Let's for now just show a circular progress indicator. So that is a very easy way to get an animation. But later on, I will then show you how we get this book pulse animation. But if this result is now not null anymore, that means we can draw our image. Here we can simply use a normal compose image, which takes in a painter, but the painter will now be our special coil image painter. So we can say the painter is equal to if our result is actually a successful result. So the image has valid dimensions that was loaded. Then we use the painter. And otherwise, if it does not have valid dimensions, we use a painter resource instead, where we can now load our failed image drawable from our local resources. I don't even know if I included this here in the app before. No, we actually don't have our drawable in here yet. I will simply paste this here because this is an XML drawable, which you can, of course, also find from GitHub below. But I think now that I realized this, I will also include this in the initial branch. So you should probably already have this here. And if not, if I forgot it for some reason, then you can still simply copy paste this XML code from the same path here and just create a new empty file, put this in there, and then you're ready. We now need to rebuild this. So make module, that's enough. And then we should have access to our new drawable resource. So we did get a compile error, which is expected since we have an issue in here. But if we now actually, let's move this into such braces. If we now type a res, this one here, .drawable book error, there it is, book error 2. Then we will create a painter from this painter resource. Cool. Next up, what we need to pass here is a content description for content description, where we can just use the title of the book, so screen readers would read that. And then what we want is a content scale. This is also dependent on the actual result here. So if the result is success, we want to use content scale.crop. So we use this typical center crop content scale style. So if the image does not fit in our dimensions, then it will be cropped. And otherwise, if this is not successful, that means we are dealing with this book error. We will use content scale that fit instead, since for this icon, it would look weird when it's cropped. And this way it still looks solid and is then centered here in our image. And then what we can do is we can say, we give this whole thing a modifier of type modifier, obviously. And I just want to give this an aspect ratio of 0.65f. So we just force every single image to have the same aspect ratio. What we also want to do is we want to set this ratio on the one hand, but we also want to set this match height constraints first, set this to true, so that it definitely tries to fill in the height here of the aspect ratio without trying the width first, since the book covers are all rather higher than wide. So this should now be enough to actually load an image and display error loading events. So the next state of our outer row would be this text section here, which is actually a column. So let's take a look up here again. So this box is the first element of our row. And if we then go down here, we can put in our column. For this column, we can now say modifier fill max height, which would normally again span the whole screen's height. If the outer row in this case does not have a fixed height, but since we assign this fixed height with this intrinsic size.min, we will make sure that this does not happen, and we will only span the available height. So pretty much the height of our image cover. And what we want to say is we want to give this column a weight of 1f. What this will do is if only the single element in this outer row has a weight of 1f, it will simply span all the available width that it can get after the other items have already been placed. And what's important is that we set vertical arrangement to arrangement.center, so these texts are just centered vertically here. The first text in here will be our book title. So book title, we can set the style to material theme dot typography dot title medium. We can give it a max lines count of 2. so that we allow it to span over 2 lines here. And then we set the overflow to text overflow.ellipses, so that if the text or the title is even longer than we can fit in 2 lines, then we will cut it off with 3 dots. Then afterwards, if there is actually an author, then we want to display that. Not all books have an author, at least in what the API provides. Some books have multiple authors. Still, here in this primary list item UI, we want to really provide a rather condensed view of everything around the book, and then display the details on the detail screen, which is why I will only show the primary author here for a book. So if we take a look at the book dot authors, then we can say first or null. So if there is an author, we call let, get the author name, and simply display a text with it. So the text is the author name. The style here would be material theme, typography, body large. For the author, we just want to allow 1 line and also set the overflow to ellipses. And then the rating text remains. You can see not all books have such a rating provided from the API, but if they do, then we want to display this as a row with a text that displays the rating value and our little star icon. So down here below the authors, we can say book rating average, average rating I call it. If that exists, we get the rating, and we can display this actually in a row here, where we can say modifier is modifier. We give this actually a vertical padding. Let's do this first. Not a vertical padding, but we center this vertically. Vertical alignment is center vertically. Center alignment dot center vertically. There it is. We actually don't need a modifier when I think about it. We just want to center this vertically, and in here we then put in our text first of all that reflects the rating that to string. So it's an integer rating. What's a double? I think double. Yes. I'm going to show that as a string, obviously. And we might also want to round this actually, since doubles often have a lot of decimal places. If we do some floating point arithmetics here, this can quickly happen since you can't accurately represent every single decimal number with a binary sequence. So sometimes if you do some logical floating point math, you will end up with something like 3.50000004 or so, which is something you've maybe faced, which is why we definitely want to round this to only 1 decimal place. So instead of actually just converting this to a string, let's say we display what we get from the round function here. We pass in our rating, we multiply this by 10 and then divide it by 10 again. So that means if our actual rating would be 4.555, for example, what we would do is we would say 4.555 multiplied by 10, which is equal to 45.55. And if we then divide this by 10 again, or this one would actually be the rounded results. If we say round this whole thing, then this would lead to 46. And if we then divide this 46 by 10, we get to 4.6 as the final value without any of these extra decimal places. That is how this works. Style is material theme dot typography body medium. And then next to that, we want to have a little star icon. So we can just say icon, image vector, icons, default, star. There we go. There is an existing item for that. The content description can be null for that. We don't really need to explain that in any way. And we then say the tint should be our sand yellow color. So we get a little nice yellow orangish icon here. And the last thing that remains is the simple icon here for this arrow, which will be displayed at the very end of our outer row. So after this column right here, where we just say we have an icon, the image vector is icons default. Actually, it's auto mirrored. This is in auto mirrored dot default. Or I used this one from filled dot. It's called keyboard arrow right. So we want to have a keyboard arrow that points to the right. Content description is null, and the modifier, let's give this a fixed size of 36 dp. And that is our book item composable, at least for now. The only thing that is missing is that we give this a proper animation here that I've shown you here with this little pulse-like animation. And also that once we loaded a book, you can see we animate this in. This is also what's currently missing here, which is what we will do later in this course. Next up, we can work on actually showing these list items in an actual list. So a lazy column in compose, which we want to put here in our components package again. So we say book list. make this a file, have a book list composable, which obviously will take in a list of books. It will get an onBook click lambda, which gives us access to the book we clicked on when we clicked on a book. And it needs an actual scroll state, which is a lazy list state. And we can default initialize this here with remember lazy list state. Like this, we can then move this down here since it's encouraged to have the modifier as the first default parameter in a list of your function signature. And in here, we can then make a lazy column. This composable is actually quite simple. The lazy column will take in the modifier we've passed. It will take in our state, our scroll state. It will take in a vertical arrangement of arrangement that's spaced by 12 dp. So if we alt enter to import dp, what this will achieve is just that we have 12 dp of spacing between all of these list items. And we can set the horizontal alignment to alignment that center horizontally. Inside of the lazy column, we want to have an items block, since we want to display a bunch of items, which will obviously be for our books. So we have our books list in here. We then get a reference to every single book in that list, and we can now use that information to show off our book list item. Pass in our book reference, give this a modifier of modifier within. I want to give this a maximum width of 700 dp, because again, we need to think of desktop as well, and I think super long stretched list items would not look that well, so we rather want to give these a max width. We can then say fill max width, so we also make sure to span over the available width, and then finally some horizontal padding. Padding horizontal of 16 dp. And lastly, when we actually click on such a list item, we can say on book click, and we pass in the book we clicked on. Something that is also worth doing is that we say items is this, and then we also give each item a unique key. Keys are pretty much the most straightforward way in a lazy column to optimize performance and to also enable item animations. So when certain items in the list change, because if we give each item, each book here, a unique key, for example, the ID, then the lazy column is smart enough to actually detect which items changed if this whole list is being replaced with a different list of books. And we can then on the one hand animate the items that changed. And on the other hand, the lazy column only needs to recompose those items that changed instead of the whole list again. So I would always recommend to pass in unique keys if you have unique keys. And I would say we now have all those reusable components that we need for our book list screen. We still need to work on this tab layout here, but I will implement this right away in this book list screen since this is quite mixed with different composables. So we need to know this list. We need to know how this looks like here in this whole layout, which is why I've decided to actually put this in the screen layout itself. So let's go here back to our book list screen. And I think for this one, it's actually worth creating a preview in our Android source set here in our previews file, since it definitely helps to actually have a real preview for the whole screen. So we can just add this here, preview, book list screen preview. We can, let's just display this right away. Book list screen root, actually not the root one. We do need to make the real screen here public. Normally I wouldn't do that because normally you could put the preview inside of this file directly and then therefore access this private composable. But since Compose multi-platform doesn't support previews in the public and in the common source set yet, let's do it this way. So we say we have a book list screen, this one, which is now very easy to preview since we can just construct a book list state on our own. Search query can stay Kotlin. Search results. Might want to have a dummy list of books here. Private val books. You can just randomly generate 100 books, for example. Say 1 to 100 map, and we map each index to a book. You can then say the ID is the current index to string. The title would be book it, so book 1, book 2, and so on. Image URL. We won't be able to display any images here in the preview anyways, at least not load these from the network. So we just pass in some kind of invalid URL. The authors, let's have a list of me. Like this. Then for the description, that is not relevant for this one. Let's just give this a description it again, in case we need this book list later on as well. Languages, also not relevant. The first published year is not relevant for this preview. The average rating is relevant. We can give this something like this. So we also check if the rounding works. The rating count is not relevant. We can pass any random number. The number of pages is not relevant here. Let's give this 100, and the number of editions is also not relevant. But now we have a sample list of dummy books we can pass in here. And this is also, as I said, the reason why I always start with a presentation layer, since now we can already check how our UI looks like. It's very easy to create dummy data, but if you start with a data layer and actually are able to load real data, but you don't have any way to really display these and work with that, then you still need to implement the whole presentation layer in addition until you're at the point where you can test this whole thing for the very first time. That is why this is typically easier. So here, do we need anything else? No. Everything else can stay the same. What is this one here for? What is that lambda? It's on action. We can leave this as an empty lambda. I also always recommend to actually name your lambdas that way, unless it's a composable content lambda, because if we have a trading lambda here, it's absolutely not obvious that this is a normal lambda and not a composable lambda. So avoid that. So if we now reload this, we should be able to see our very basic book list screen with our single book search bar. No, it actually seems to complain. We need to build and refresh. Yes, there we go. Here's our book list screen preview. Awesome. So from this, we now somehow need to get to this. And that happens here in the book list screen. I don't know if I can actually split this here maybe a little bit. Can I split right? Does this do something? And if I then expand this over here, oh, this is very hacky, but if we then switch over here, then we do have a working preview pretty much. Very cool. If we, let's make this full screen preview. And if I now change something, I'm curious if this automatically refreshes the preview in another file. So let's give this a different background color of color red, for example. Then we apparently still need to click here. Yes, there we go. So apparently it doesn't automatically switch and refresh the preview. We need to still do that on our own. But this is a hacky way to make the Compose preview work in Compose multi-platform as of now, until that's supported in the common main source set as well. So you can see we have our search bar. And after that, we now want to have our lazy column with this kind of rounded corner shape, and in the end, just a white surface. So that is what we will go on with. We will have the surface composable again. We set the modifier to modifier weight 1f again. So we just make this white thing span the remaining height of our screen, and then say it also fills the maximum width. The color of this will be our desert white. And the shape will be a rounded corner shape. Here we really only want to have these rounded corners for these top two corners. So we say top start is 32 dp, top end as well. And then if we open up the surface, we should already see when we refresh the preview that we have our surface here. Yes, there we go. This looks pretty much like on the left. Very cool. Now what comes next is we want to have a column here, because on the one hand we have this tab row, which is a single composable, and then we have what comes after this tab row, so our actual book list. And since we want to arrange these both in a column-wise fashion, we will make use of a column. This column will have a modifier, or actually not, just horizontal alignment. So we center everything horizontally, alignment, center horizontally. Then in here, we do have this tab row, which is a material composable for now displaying these multiple tab items. Here we need to pass in the selected tab index, which we get from our state. The modifier is modifier. We give this some padding of actually vertical padding of 12 dp. So this is this vertical padding that you can see here. This orange highlight has a bit of vertical padding. We again say within maximum 700p for the same reasons I've mentioned before, and then fill the whole width that we have. In here, in this content of the tab row, we can now specify those tab items, so single tabs. Our search results on the one hand, and the favorites. That works with tabs, surprise, surprise. But we now need to say whether this tab is selected or not, so whether I want to draw this orange kind of a border there. For this first tab, it's selected if the state selected tab index is 0, So if it's the first one that's selected, if we click this first tab item, we need to trigger our onAction lambda, since that is a user action that triggers some sort of state change, switching the tabs here, where we say book list action dot on tab selected, and the selected tab is tab number 0. The modifier here will be modifier weight 1f, so we just want to evenly distribute these tabs here over the row, because this is